December 1944, West Texas. The train shrieked against cold iron and the air tasted like dust. On the platform, a group of German women stood rigid, braced for punishment. They were the enemy, and they knew what that meant: fences, hard labor, humiliation. One woman, Marta, held her daughter's hand tight, expecting the absolute worst. But as they were led through the gates, an American soldier handed her a blanket, and it smelled of soap, not war. That night, a rumor started to spread through the barracks, a whisper so unbelievable they were sure it was a trick. The Americans weren't planning interrogations. They were throwing them a Christmas party. Before we find out what happened next, if you believe in the power of these forgotten stories, hit that subscribe button. I'm always fascinated to see how far these stories travel, so let me know what city you're watching from in the comments. The women were herded off the train like cattle, their faces pale against the endless flat brown of the Texas landscape. The wind had a different voice here, a low moan that promised no comfort, carrying dust that settled in their hair and on their lips. Among them was Marta Engelhardt, her hand a tight, protective cage around her daughter's smaller one. Tucked inside her coat was a letter from her husband, a prisoner somewhere in this vast country, at a camp called Hereford. The paper was worn thin along the creases, the ink faded, his words a ghost she carried across an ocean. The letter was months old, perhaps the last one she would ever receive. His last line was not of love, but of survival. Be strong for both of us. Strength was all she had left. She had prepared herself for punishment, for camps that mirrored the ones whispered about back home, for hard labor that would break their backs, for the cold, righteous fury of the victors. She remembered the firestorms of Dresden, the sky turned to orange ash, the world ending one city at a time. This was the consequence. This was the price. The American guards watched them with unreadable eyes, their faces young and strangely smooth, as if they had never seen a city burn. She kept her head down, a silent instruction to her daughter, and to the younger women who looked to her for answers she didn't have. She felt the defiant gaze of Annalise, the 17-year-old orphan who attached herself to Marta's side. The girl's chin was always tilted up, a small act of war against the inevitable. "We are here as the enemy," Marta whispered, her voice barely a scratch in the wind. It was not a warning. It was a statement of fact, a reminder of the chasm that separated them from these men in khaki. She needed the others to remember it too, before they mistook silence for kindness. They were marched toward a compound enclosed by barbed wire, the fence posts stark against the setting sun. But as they drew closer, Marta saw something that made her falter. Through the wire, she saw German men, prisoners. They were raking leaves into small piles, their movements unhurried, almost peaceful. There were no bruises on their faces, no chains on their ankles. They wore clean, mended clothes. They were laughing, a low, quiet sound that the wind nearly stole away. One of them, a man with a familiar, tired stoop to his shoulders, looked up and saw the group of women. He paused, his rake held loose in his hands, and then he raised a hand. Not in a salute, not in defiance, but in a simple, human wave. Annalisa gasped softly beside her. Marta's heart hammered against her ribs, a confused bird trapped in a cage. A female volunteer, an American with kind lines around her eyes, moved down their small, huddled line, handing out thick wool blankets. When she reached Marta, she offered one with a small, hesitant smile. Marta took it numbly. The wool was rough, but it was clean. It smelled overwhelmingly of soap. Not the harsh, lye-based soap of the homeland, but something floral, something domestic, something from a life that no longer existed. The scent was a shock, a memory so potent it nearly brought her to her knees. She buried her face in the fabric for a moment, breathing in the smell of simple, ordinary dignity. It felt like a trap. Later that night, huddled together for warmth in the sparse barracks, the whispers began. Annalisa had been trying to speak with one of the guards, using the few English words she knew. She returned to their corner, her eyes wide with a dangerous light. "They are planning something," she said, her voice a hushed, excited rush. "For Christmas." The word fell into the silence of the room like a stone in a well. Christmas. It was a word from another world, another time. A few of the women scoffed. "A trick," one of them muttered, a woman whose husband had fallen at Stalingrad. "They want to parade us for their newspapers. Look how the benevolent Americans treat the wives of monsters." Another woman, younger, with the baby sleeping in her arms, dared to voice a different thought. "But what if? What if they don't?" Marta said nothing. She listened to the debate rise and fall, the sharp edges of fear scraping against the soft, desperate tissue of hope. She thought of the laughing men, the simple wave, the impossible scent of soap. These were not things that fit inside the story she knew, the story of victors and vanquished. They were stray threads, and she did not know what to do with them. When the talking finally subsided and the others drifted into an uneasy sleep, Marta lay awake, fully dressed. She tucked the blanket around her daughter, pulling it up to her chin, and then, without making a sound, she reached down and made sure her boots were still laced tight. Just in case. In the steam-filled camp kitchen, Corporal Elias Monroe worked with a quiet, steady rhythm. The thud of peeled potatoes hitting the water was the only sound he paid attention to, a metronome for his thoughts. He was a small, unassuming man with flour dust permanently settled in the lines of his hands. Two military policemen leaned against the doorframe, their voices loud and careless as they laughed about the new arrivals. "Heard they're mostly women and kids," one of them said, nudging the other. "Maybe we should give the Krauts a real American Christmas, turkey and all." The other one snorted. "Yeah, give 'em a feast before we send 'em to the stockade." They chuckled and walked away, their boots echoing down the hall. But Eli wasn't laughing. Their joke had landed in his heart not as an absurdity, but as a possibility, a necessity. He had spent weeks already, carefully, quietly, convincing the quartermaster to release small portions of the good stuff, a little extra dried fruit here, a tin of molasses there. He'd traded his own cigarette rations for a bag of precious, white flour. He wasn't planning a feast to mock them. He was planning to bake something real, something that tasted of home. Not their home necessarily, but the idea of it, the memory of warmth and safety that everyone, even the enemy, carried inside them. Eli's mind drifted back, as it often did, to his mother's kitchen in Alabama during the first Great War. He remembered the smell of cinnamon and baking apples. He'd been a boy watching her pack pies into a basket. They weren't for them. They were for the colored soldiers from the nearby training camp, the men who weren't allowed to eat in the town's restaurants. When he'd asked her why, she'd wiped her hands on her apron, looked him square in the eye and said, "Because you feed a man like he matters, Elias. Doesn't matter what uniform he wears or what skin he's in, you feed his soul, and the rest follows." He carried that instruction like Scripture. It was the only gospel he was sure of. Not having been sent overseas himself because of a weak leg from a childhood illness, he felt a quiet shame, a debt he could only repay in small gestures of service. This was his front line. He wasn't entirely alone in his quiet mission. He found an ally in Reverend Samuel Blackwood, the local Baptist pastor who volunteered at the camp. Reverend Blackwood was a tall, solemn man who walked with the weight of a grief that had settled deep into his bones. He came to the camp not to preach fire and brimstone, but to offer a quiet presence, to sit with the men who requested a prayer, and to simply bear witness to the humanity behind the enemy uniforms. The pastor's only son, a boy not much older than Eli, had been killed just months before at the Battle of the Bulge. The news had hollowed him out, leaving behind a faith that was less about answers and more about endurance. When Eli tentatively mentioned his idea for Christmas, a flicker of something pained but determined crossed the Reverend's face. He nodded slowly. "My boy, he loved Christmas carols," he said, his voice thick. A few days later, Reverend Blackwood appeared with a small choir of school children from his congregation. He stood them in a cold, empty mess hall and had them practice German carols he'd found in an old hymnal. Hearing the children's high, uncertain voices sing Stille Nacht in the heart of a POW camp felt like a prayer and a wound all at once. The Reverend's face was a stiff mask of restraint, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. This was how he mourned. This was how he obeyed the last words his son had written in a letter home: "Be kind." But their plan, born of quiet conviction and private grief, soon met the hard wall of military reality. Captain Hensley, the camp's liaison officer, a man who saw the world in regulations and potential public relations disasters, got wind of it. He called Eli and the Reverend into his office. "Keep it quiet," he warned, his voice low and firm. "I can't have the folks back home thinking we're coddling Nazis. It's a bad look." One of the guards overheard the conversation and spat on the ground as they left the office. "Treason," the guard muttered, loud enough for them to hear. "My brother's in a German camp. I wonder if they're baking him pies." A week before Christmas, a local paper ran a small inflammatory headline: "Christmas with the enemy?" The question hung in the air, thick with accusation. Eli felt the weight of it, the risk, the cold stares of the other soldiers. But that night, back in his kitchen, under the dim glow of a single bulb, he laid out his salvaged ingredients, his mother's voice a clear, steady whisper in his ear. The day before Christmas, a guard came to the women's barracks. He didn't shout or brandish his rifle. He stood in the doorway and announced, his voice uncertain, that they were invited to the main mess hall. A wave of suspicion rippled through the room. Marta felt her jaw tighten. This was it, the performance. They would be seated, photographed, and used as props in a story of American benevolence. She held her daughter's hand and followed the others, her posture as rigid as a courtroom defendant. But the mess hall was not what she expected. Gone were the long, sterile benches. In their place were smaller tables covered in butcher paper and decorated with small, scraggly branches of pine. Strings of colored lights, salvaged from some forgotten storeroom, were draped precariously from the rafters, casting a soft, uneven glow. The air smelled of wood smoke and something sweet. It was a fragile, almost desperate attempt at festivity, and that vulnerability was more disarming than any show of force. The women took their seats cautiously, perched on the edge of their chairs, as if ready to flee at a moment's notice. Then Reverend Blackwood walked to the front of the room, followed by the small choir of children. Their faces were scrubbed clean, their eyes wide and nervous. He said a few quiet words about peace, about a holy night long ago. His voice held no judgment, only a deep, resonant weariness. And then the children began to sing. Their voices, thin and pure, rose into the rafters with the words of Stille Nacht. At first, the German women just listened, their faces stone masks of disbelief. But the melody was a key, unlocking rooms inside them they had long since boarded up. Annalise was the first to join in, her voice clear and defiant. Then another woman, then another, until a low, humming chorus of German filled their side of the room. On the other side, the children, guided by the Reverend, switched to English. For a breathtaking moment, the two languages intertwined, a braid of shared memory and shared sorrow. Along the walls, a few of the German POWs, the men from the camp, had been allowed to stand and watch under guard. Their faces were etched with a profound, unbearable longing. As the last note faded, a woman from the town placed a small, hand-carved wooden bird into the hands of Marta's daughter. It was simple, unpainted, but the wood was sanded smooth as silk. Her daughter clutched it to her chest, her eyes shining with a wonder that felt more dangerous than any weapon. Marta looked around, trying to find the carver, but no one met her gaze. The gift was anonymous, an act of grace from the shadows. It was then that Eli Monroe emerged from the kitchen. He carried 2 large steaming pies, their crusts a perfect golden brown. The smell of baked apples and cinnamon filled the room, a scent so deeply tied to peace and home that it was physically painful. He began slicing the pie and placing a warm, fragrant piece on each woman's plate. He moved with a quiet reverence, as if performing a sacred rite. The room fell completely silent. The only sound was the scrape of the knife against the tin. When a plate was set before Marta, she could not move. She stared at the steam rising from the apples, at the generosity so plain and inexplicable. It felt like an accusation. Tears she had refused to shed in the face of fire and famine began to slip down her cheeks, hot and shameful. She looked up at Eli, this soft-spoken American boy, and a single, whispered question escaped her lips, a sound of breaking ice. Why? He paused, his hands still, and met her gaze. His eyes were clear, without pity or pride. "Because it's Christmas," he said, his voice low and steady, "and because you're a person." In that instant, the world cracked open. The carefully constructed walls of enemy and ally, victor and vanquished, crumbled into dust. There was only the warmth of the pie, the weight of the toy, the echo of the song. There was only a shared and fragile humanity. And then the main door of the mess hall flew open with a bang. A man stood silhouetted against the cold night, his uniform crisp, his face set like granite. He was a military inspector, and his arrival sucked the warmth from the room as if a window had shattered. The music, a scratchy record of carols someone had put on, screeched to a halt. The guards, who had been relaxed and smiling, snapped to attention. The inspector's cold gaze swept over the scene, the lights, the children, the food, the German women sitting at the tables. His face hardened. He barked an order, and 2 MPs began moving through the room, confiscating the half-eaten pie, gathering the wooden toys. One of them pried the little bird from Marta's daughter's uncomprehending hands. Marta was pulled aside, a guard's hand firm on her arm. A sharp, formal voice demanded to know who she was, what she was doing there, who had approved this. She could only stare back, mute and humiliated. From across the room she saw the inspector dressing down Reverend Blackwood, his finger jabbing at the pastor's chest, accusing him of undermining military discipline. She saw Captain Hensley, his face pale, trying to explain as another officer told Eli he was being recommended for immediate reassignment. The party was over. The hope that had bloomed so unexpectedly was trampled under the heel of a military boot. They were marched back to their quarters in silence. The cold of the night felt absolute now, a cold that seeped into the bone. Back in the darkness of the barracks, Marta's daughter finally began to cry, a heart-wrenching, inconsolable sound. She wasn't crying for the lost toy. She was calling for her father. Marta held her, rocking back and forth in the dark, and felt a new and terrible kind of shame. It was not the shame of defeat. It was the humiliation of having been foolish enough to believe for just 1 hour that she was seen as a person. Cruelty she could have endured. It was the hope, so freely given and so brutally taken away, that was now unbearable. A week passed. The fragile warmth of that Christmas Eve felt like a fever dream, a collective hallucination. A light snow fell, a rare and startling sight in West Texas, dusting the brown fields with a thin layer of white. The silence in the women's barracks was heavier than before, thick with unspoken disappointment. Marta had withdrawn into herself, a turtle pulling its head into a shell of grim resignation. She hadn't spoken more than a few necessary words to anyone in days, not even to Annalisa, whose youthful defiance had been replaced by a sullen, wounded quiet. The memory of the confiscated pie, the kindness rescinded, was a bitter taste that lingered. The repercussions of the party unfolded with quiet, bureaucratic efficiency. Eli Monroe was packing his things. He had been reassigned to a supply depot 300 miles away, a punishment disguised as a transfer. He moved through his kitchen one last time, wiping down counters that were already clean, his movements slow and deliberate. Reverend Blackwood received a formal letter from Camp Command informing him that his volunteer privileges had been indefinitely suspended. He was no longer welcome. The gate that had briefly opened was now shut, bolted, and reinforced. The system had corrected itself, but hope, once planted, has deep roots. It can be cut back, but it is not so easily killed. One afternoon, a guard brought Marta a small, neatly wrapped bundle. Her heart seized, thinking it was from her husband, but the package was from Reverend Blackwood. Inside was a small, leather-bound Bible. In the margin of the first page, her name, Marta Engelhardt, was engraved in delicate gold leaf. Tucked between the pages of the Psalms was a folded, brittle piece of paper. It was a letter, not from the Reverend, but a copy of the last one he had received from his son. The words were simple, written by a young man facing his own mortality with a clarity that pierced the soul. "I don't know what will happen to me," he had written, "but if I don't make it home, be kind. That's all I ask. Don't let the hate win." Reading those words, Marta understood that the Christmas party had not been an act of pity. It had been an act of obedience, a promise kept. The following day, just before he was driven away in a drab army truck, Eli found a way to pass a small, grease-stained parcel to her through a friendly guard. Inside, wrapped in waxed paper, was not a piece of pie, but the recipe for it, written out in a careful, steady hand. Below the instructions for flour, sugar, and apples, he had added a short note. "Bake it for someone who doesn't expect it," it read. It was not just a recipe, it was a charge, a baton being passed in a relay race of grace. Marta folded the paper carefully and tucked it beside her husband's letter, 2 testaments to 2 different kinds of survival. Weeks turned into a month. The official story of the unauthorized celebration was buried in paperwork, a minor incident to be forgotten. But the unofficial story began to spread. A local teacher who had brought her students to sing had been profoundly moved by what she'd witnessed. She wrote an anonymous letter to the editor of a small regional newspaper, a publication that mostly reported on crop prices and church socials. She described the scene not as a security breach, but as a moment of profound humanity. "They came to us as the enemy, expecting punishment," she wrote. "They sat at our tables, and for a brief time, in the glow of Christmas lights, they were just mothers and daughters who missed their homes. They left knowing grace." The piece was small, tucked away in the back pages, but it was passed around. A copy found its way to a Red Cross office. A chaplain at another camp read it aloud to his fellow officers. Veterans home from the front and wrestling with their own ghosts read the words and felt a flicker of something other than anger. The story circulated not like a fire, but like an underground spring, quietly nourishing the dry ground of policy and protocol. Imperceptibly at first, things began to shift. A directive came down to improve the quality of food in the civilian camps. Another memo suggested allowing more correspondence between prisoners and their families. It was nothing dramatic, no grand reversal. It was simply a slow, quiet turning toward compassion, a lessening of suspicion. A small light had been kindled in the dark, and though the powers that be had tried to snuff it out, its glow was now reflecting in places they could not reach. Months later, Marta was no longer just a prisoner. Along with several other women, she was granted permission to work in a local laundry, earning a small wage. The days were long and filled with the smell of steam and bleach, but it was a life. One evening, in the small kitchen of the converted farmhouse where they were now housed, she took out the recipe. With flour she had saved from her earnings, she showed her daughter how to measure and knead, how to slice the apples thin. As they worked, their hands dusty with flour, they hummed Silent Night. Outside, a pie cooled on the windowsill, its scent mingling with the Texas twilight. Marta looked at her daughter, whose face was so serious with the task of crimping the crust. "Your father would have liked this place," she said softly, the words surprising even herself. "Not for what it was, but for what it let us become